I start in the name of Lord of the Universe, the most gracious and most merciful. Agent here, property analyst. Today we have come with a topic called buffer zone. So everyone commonly know buffer zone as lake bed. There is FTL buffer zone or lake bed buffer zone, that's all. So I'm going to talk about the most common buffer zones, then moderately common, then most uncommon buffer zones. And what is buffer zone? Thing is, buffer zone is nothing but a restricted area, you can call. It can be restricted with an NOC or it can be restricted normally. So coming back to a topic, the most common buffer zones, that is wetlands. That is, first thing is we have lake bed, normally called as FTL buffer zones. Full tank level, that is so we'll have a reserved area for buffer zones, then reservoirs, then rajkalvas, nalas, then drains. So same thing, we call that as dams, and the big reservoirs will have their own buffer zones. And normally the restriction for this kind of areas is to avoid flooding, then ground level, to increase the ground level and to maintain the ecosystem. So next, coming to the most common, that is airport buffer zones. So airport will have its own restriction areas. So normally no fly zone, you can call, or no construction zone. Height restrictions from ARP, that is airport reference point. From the reference point you have to take like at least 5 kilometers you have huge restrictions. Majorly the 2 kilometers no construction or something. So we are not going in depth of distance and all, just I'm telling. So you'll have restrictions on height of construction. Then if you're flyer of drone, then drone restrictions you will have. A third one, that is railway buffer zone. So railway, from its boundary you will have buffer zones. Very uncommon, and many people doesn't know about this. Railway will have from its boundary a different kind of buffer zone, and from the railway also there is a buffer zone, or from the boundary also there is a buffer zone. So you have to be quite careful in purchasing of properties of this kind. Then coming to highway buffer zones, national highway will have its own buffer zone and state highway will have its own buffer zone. High tension buffer zones, if you see, there is this power lines going above, no, from that you have vertical buffer zone also and horizontal buffer zone also. It depends on the kVA, whatever 300 or whatever kVA it is, it depends on that. 66 kVA, 110 kVA, 440 volts, and different kind of high tensions, you have different kind of buffer zones. Then next, military area buffer zones, that is like restriction for the safety or security purpose. Then you have industrial buffer zone. So industrial, nothing but that chemicals or the sound and odor, noise pollution and environmental pollution. For that you will have their own buffer zones. So these are the most common. And another I want to list in most common is pipeline buffer zones. That is, you have gas pipeline, BWSSB, or means sewage pipelines. Then you have water pipelines. So these pipelines will have their own restrictions. So these are the list of most common buffer zones you will face in day-to-day life. Coming to the moderate buffer zone are you have quarry and mining that will have their buffer zones. Like normally blast happens, they blast, then environmental, the wind pressure which pulls in, so that will have, so based on that they'll give restrictions. Another thing is you have landfills buffer zone. So normally when these quarries are left as it is, then the landfill is done with some chemical hazards or different kind of categories it is done. So that will have its own restrictions of buffer zone. Then coming to another one is waste management. That is, normally they use for this kind of lands for segregation. This has to be quite away from city or where there is no population. So this will have a huge restriction, a quite lengthy buffer zones this will have. So because the groundwater will absorb all this kind of waste material what is being segregated due to water, rains, everything, the total surrounding villages will be affected from this kind of zones. So huge buffer zone on this also you have. Then talking about another thing is the forest buffer zone. That is, you have zoo, reservoir, like this kind of having the eco-sensitive zone it is called. So these areas like zoos, then forest area, forest reserved forest, and these kind of forests will have their own buffer zones. So that is also moderately common. Like many people doesn't know that even forest land will have their own buffer zones. Like normally military you would know, but forest land will have their own buffer zone. Then talking about the most uncommon buffer zones, that are seashore, that is CZ zone, that is sea, you will have that restrictions on sea coastal area, coastal sensitive zone, that is you will have its own restrictions. Then you have prisons like jail, you will call, no, that will have their own restriction. Then research and observation, then solar plant will have its restriction, then wind turbines will have its restrictions. Then you have slopes and hillocks will have its own restrictions. Then heritage zones like Taj Mahal or any heritage zone, it can be religious heritage zones, these will have their own buffer zones. So this was the video of today, like most uncommon and common buffer zones. So you have to be quite careful from these kind of buffer zones, where lot of issues happens while purchasing property. You have to be careful, and another hazards, like different kind of hazard, health hazards also you get. So you have to avoid this kind of zones. Like example, the landfill and segregation of waste is quite dangerous. Like your borewell water, everything will have that chemicals including, so indirectly you're going to be at very high risk. So you have to be quite careful from this kind of buffer zones. So let me know in the comments if you know any other buffer zones, so that we can also share the knowledge to others. And let me know if you have any queries on it. So by Agent Lee, property analyst. Thank you.